welcome back to Dusty's Keto Kitchen. And yes, I think that's what I'm going to stick with. I don't know, let's vote. Dusty's Keto Cooking or Dusty's Keto Kitchen? Feel free to comment below on what your opinion is. I personally think I'm going to stick with Dusty's Keto Kitchen. I kind of like it. So today we are going to be doing a Salisbury steak and garlic butter mashed cauliflower. Yeah. So now we're not going to do potatoes with all of this because, you know, the starch and so on and so forth. So we want to make this as keto friendly as possible. So once I get this all figured out, as like I said, of course, at the end when I kind of go over everything, I will go over what the macros and stuff and, you know, kind of what to expect. Right now I've already started, you know, somewhat prepping stuff, getting ready for making things pretty simple so you don't have to watch me prep everything, because there's not really any point to watching me prep stuff because it's all pretty simple, and I'll kind of, you know, describe it as I go. So anyways, let's get cooking. All right, here we go. So first thing we're going to start with is getting the pork rinds ready. So these are going to go in the meat, or into the actual Salisbury steak. So this is kind of doing the whole meatloaf where you put breadcrumbs. This is kind of the replacement for breadcrumbs because there's no carbohydrates in pork rinds. So in total I need a full cup of pork rinds, of ground pork rinds. So I've got the food processor here. I'm going to go ahead and fill this up. And then once I get these ground down, I am going to put them in a pan with a couple tablespoons of butter and kind of brown them and get them crispy, so that way, one, they get the flavor, and two, they just end up with a better texture in the actual meat itself. There we go. So essentially what we're doing with this is we're toasting it, again, to get it crispy, so it acts more like a breadcrumb than it does something that gets kind of messy inside the meat. So we're going to let that sit for a few minutes. The next thing is we're going to start adding our seasoning to our ground beef. Now, if you notice the ground beef, I did this weird bowl thing with it. I do that because, one, I want the temperature to come up in the ground beef, because the warmer the beef is, the better it mixes together as far as texture is concerned. And when I make my meatloaf, I actually try to get my beef up as high or as close to room temperature as possible, because when it warms up, the fat breaks down and so does the meat, and it gives more of a creamy texture when you're trying to mix it together, which is really kind of what I'm shooting for. So anytime I do my recipes, as I've told you, because I'm meal prepping to try to, you know, have more throughout the week, so I have to cook less, because if I don't keep it simple, I'm not going to do it, right? So I double my recipes. The only thing I'm not doubling is the cauliflower, because I forgot to buy a second head of cauliflower. So I got 2 pounds of ground beef. I'm going to do 2 eggs. We got 2 teaspoons of salt, half a teaspoon of garlic powder, apparently there was some moisture in there, and a half a teaspoon of black pepper. And then 2 tablespoons of Worcestershire. And then as soon as the pork rinds are done, then those will go in here also. Now while the pork rinds are cooking, I'm going to set that aside for a minute, and I'm going to start chopping this up. So I'm going to be chopping this up just in a small bit because I just want it to fit into the food processor. I'm not doing anything fancy, but I want to grind this down as fine as I can get it in the food processor, because I want this to come out more mashed, like, so they can make it, seem like I'm eating potatoes. That's probably one thing I miss most on this lifestyle change with keto, is not having my potatoes. It wasn't unusual for me to go through a 5-pound bag a week. Alright, let's load these up here. Keep dropping them on the floor. That's probably not good. Set this aside for right now so I can work on the cauliflower. Alright, so I got this all cut down through the food processor. It's pretty fine. There's going to be some other stuff that's going to help, add some creaminess to it, so we'll get there. And by the way, this cauliflower is really messy. Alright, so this is what happens when you don't follow instructions. So I made an assumption instead of following the directions. So first of all, you're supposed to get a pot of water like you do with potatoes, cut it into chunks and boil them until they're soft. And then you drain them and then put them in the food processor. So I've just made my job really complicated for no reason. So now I'm going to take this and throw this in the microwave for a while, and then hopefully it'll break down, which I know it will some, and we're not going to have the creamiest of potatoes, but hey, we learn and make mistakes, right? So if you follow the instructions correctly, like I said, you boil it, and then you take it out, rinse it, or not rinse it, but dry it off as best you can, and then you put it in the food processor. Like I said, I didn't do that, so we're gonna kind of modify our process here. All right, so while the cauliflower is microwaving, I'm gonna go ahead and start preparing the rest of the stuff for the Salisbury. So the recipe, like I told you, I'm doubling. The recipe calls for a half of a medium onion. I am doubling it, so 1 medium onion for me. Now the onion is for the gravy, so this isn't going into the hamburger. This is being cooked on the side and going to be caramelized. So you want to have them thin, and you don't want to chop them too much. And that's about all I'm going to do to the onions. Alright, so the next step is we're going to take the onions. Well, first I'm going to get some of the butter in here. So we need a tablespoon or 2 tablespoons of butter since I'm doubling the recipe. Butter's hot. Let's get these onions in here. Now when it comes to seasoning these onions, it doesn't really need a lot. so it doesn't really specify a certain amount. So you can just season salt and pepper to taste for these. If you like stuff with a little extra salt, you go ahead and throw a little extra salt, but I just used a couple pinches. So the next thing, after getting the onions, they're starting to caramelize. I want those to get, down to where they're brown and soft. The next thing I'm going to do is I want to preheat the oven to 350 degrees because while I am portioning out the Salisbury steak and searing the outside, they're going to go on the pan and go in the oven and get finished in the oven. So the recipe is 4 patties per pound, so about 1/4 pound patties. So I'm going to try to get it as close to that as I can. Matter of fact, to make my life easier, I have the scale for a reason. Let's use it. So the only purpose that we're using this pan for is to sear the meat. So as you see over here, they're just brown on the outside, they're still raw on the inside. I just have a skillet over here that's turned up to max just to sear the outside. When you're done, don't throw away the grease that's in the pan because that's part of what we're going to be making the gravy out of. Now once your oven's preheated, they go in the oven for 10 minutes at 350 degrees. It would be really nice if I had an extra hand. Now, I'm going to turn this down so this stuff doesn't burn. So while those are in the oven, we're going to go ahead and start putting stuff together for the gravy. So I'm going to go and move you guys back down here so you can see it. So I had to make au jus because all I had was the powder, so that's ready. So as I mentioned, my recipe is going to be double. So I need a 1/4 cup of au jus. A 1/4 cup of heavy cream. And then we've already seasoned the onions. Alright, while that's getting happy, let's work on these mashed potatoes. Alright, so with the mash, I'm going to be adding 3 tablespoons of butter, a tablespoon of cream cheese, half a teaspoon of minced garlic, and then as far as the salt and pepper goes, we are an 1/8 of a teaspoon of black pepper. And then now this actually calls for chicken bouillon, which I don't have, so it says you can substitute for salt, so I'm doing a 1/2 of a teaspoon of salt. And then I'm going to grab my masher and see how this ends up turning out. the recipe actually also calls for Parmesan cheese. So it's a 1/4 cup of Parmesan cheese, and I have just enough for this recipe. You know, I'm back to the Parmesan Reggiano. And I'm using a potato peeler. All right, so we have Salisbury steak, we have gravy, and we have a cauliflower. So let's get this plated up. There we go.